Hello, good afternoon, Miss Maitali. So great to see you here. Thank you so much for being here with me today for our Legacy of Liberation interview. Yes. Well, I'm going to begin by reading your illustrious bio. Maitali Kumar performed extensively in India before moving to the U.S. and founded Abhinaya Dance Company of San Jose in 1980. Her artistic ability and choreography have been recognized through several grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and from state and city agencies. Kumar has toured with the company to India and other parts of the U.S. and has taught Indian dance at Stanford University, San Jose State University, and University of California, Santa Cruz. Kumar has been awarded Lifetime Achievement Awards for her pioneering work. Since 1986, the company has collaborated with Japanese taiko drummers, Balinese gamelans ensemble, and presented social justice themes through the lives of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and farm worker struggles. In 2026, Kumar was selected as YWC A Tribute to Women honoree. Thank you. Right. Great. Let's begin. We want to go back to all the way beginning and honoring your legacy. Tell me a little bit about the beginning of your journey. Where were you in your life, when this cultural work began, and why was it important to you?
Well, in school, when I was in school in second grade, I was part of a dance, school production, and my father happened to see me and decided, oh, she has some talent. And so he had a teacher come to my house in Bombay. I was in Mumbai, so he had a teacher come to my house for 3 days a week. And that's when I started dancing. I started learning dance, Bharatanatyam, when I was 8 years old in Mumbai. And I used to learn, and then he was pretty influential, so he used to get me performances. So within 3 years, I had, picked up quite a bit. I would do solo performances, and I don't know what my quality was at that time, but I was dancing a lot. But it was only in my teens when I came into a group workshop. I started learning a different style, Kuchipudi, which is from Andhra Pradesh. Bharatanatyam is from Tamil Nadu, and they're separate states in South India. So in that group thing, when you're getting noticed, and when, somebody else, in a group, you get noticed. Like as a solo dancer, you don't care. Your teacher's there and you're dancing and you're all fine. But when you start getting noticed and, then the interest kind of develops, you get encouraged by it. So in that process, I think only in my teens, I really started getting interested and getting, a lot more opportunities to perform. Then we moved to Delhi, and in New Delhi, I had the opportunity to continue my dance. Then I moved to Hyderabad, which is South Central, and I learned Kuchipudi, and I learned it in, a greater depth, and got a scholarship to do that. And then my teacher was in Chennai, which is South India. So in Hyderabad was where I started dancing professionally. And through all this time, I was also doing my academics. I was doing my bachelor's in nutrition, and then I did master's in nutrition. But, because that is what you do in India. It's like dancing was not considered something you would take as a profession really at that point at all. It was very clear that once you got married, you would stop it. You would stop the dancing. Very few dancers continued it beyond their marriage. So, learning something academically was very important. So, did my master's, but my teacher was in Chennai, and then she would keep coming, and we'd be performing all over. And then in 1978, I got a Rotary International Fellowship to come to the U.S. as both as a cultural ambassador as well as for my academics. I went to UC Davis for a year of study, which was fully funded by the Rotary International. So because of that, I came to the U.S. In 1978. So, and once I came, I finished my year of study, and then I also met my husband. He was at Stanford. He was a professor there in assistant professor in Stanford. So we met, and we got married in 1979. And then I settled down here. And 1980, it didn't look like I was getting any opportunities to do a lot of solo performances. Obviously, just within the community, they would have small functions and they'd say, okay, well, you danced for 10 minutes. And here I was performing for 2 hours on my own, solo performances in India and Bharatanatyam. And any dance style was like, no, with live music. And here they'd say, dance for 10 minutes, dance for 20 minutes, and say, oh, dance for 10 minutes. And so performance opportunities were very, very limited. And so when a group of friends said, why don't you teach our children? And, I jumped at the opportunity. I started in a garage in 1980 with 6 students. And, it was interesting because I was now imparting the style. So when you're teaching, you're also learning because you're teaching, you're going over the fundamentals yourself. You're realizing posture is so important, something that you didn't. Your teacher was correcting, now you're correcting your younger ones. So teaching is a process where you're learning and you're also imparting. And you're also creating because I didn't want to teach them my high level, high stand, the in terms of high level, what meaning, I don't mean in high level in quality, but I meant in standard of grade of dancing, right? You're not immediately, you're not going to teach a 6-year-old what a 24-year-old is doing in terms of technique. So to bring it down to their level, I started creating new pieces for them as well. Little pieces, smaller pieces for them. And my husband was also a musician. So when he was in association with a lot of other musicians in the area, so we had the opportunity to meet with all these musicians and create new pieces, create new little, items for all the younger ones. As they grew older, they'd get, more proficient, we'd make it more difficult. So that's how I got into the dance, and continued it because I had to keep the cultural tradition alive. Since I didn't have an opportunity to perform, the only way to keep it alive was to, teach the next generation. So that's what happened. And then in 1983, I had my first Arangetram, which is the solo dance debut. My student had already learned elsewhere. Normally it takes about 6 to 8 years of training before they get onto the stage, but this girl had already learned before. And so when she came to me from 1980 to 1983, she was, 14 years old and she was ready. And so I presented her with live musicians, local musicians. And it was a great hit in the sense everybody appreciated the fact that not only did she dance, but I taught her how to explain everything before she performed. So that was a revelation for them that, that they could understand what was going on, not just see it, but understand every story that was being done. So, and at the same time in 1983, I had my first daughter. And I also had my teacher from India come visiting with another performing group. And she said, Maithili, why are you just sitting with all this stuff behind you? You had so much stuff that you've been doing all these years. What happened? You just kind of stored it away in a drawer somewhere. So she egged me on. And that led me to do my first performing tour in 1984. I got onto the phone and she gave me some contacts. And so I called cities in Canada and with the US, and I did a 16-city tour in 1984 with live musicians that I brought over from India. And so, that kind of moved me on to the next level. Otherwise, it would have just been teaching and young students, but my performing career kind of came back on track, and because I did that tour. And in 1986 I had already trained about 6-7 students, good students. I think the community really appreciated that I was maintaining the standards, the high artistic standards, and not just letting them get on stage as soon as they learn something, putting them on stage. But they were all, in their teens, they were all good dancers. And so when I put a production on, our first production was in 1986. That's when we had this person called Mei Chang, who I'm really grateful to. I don't even know where she is now, but she came to the show and she said, my goodness, you're doing all this. You should be applying for grants. you should be applying to the Ethnic Dance Festival. You should be doing this. You should be doing that. And she was part of, she had just formed the Asian Heritage Council. So she got me into that, and she got me into applying for grants. And so we got our first grant in 1986. We got our first production, our appearance at the Ethnic Dance Festival in 1986. It was like, that was a key year for us to, start our process. And since after that, we just kept getting grants year after year from the local Arts Council. It was called Arts Council of Santa Clara County at that time. And then we got grants from the California Arts Council. And then in 1989, I got my first National Endowment for the Arts Choreographers Fellowship. And I did a new production, and that's when I brought musicians from India, and I went on another tour in 1989. So, and therefore in 1990, I had performed once in the tour. I performed in Victoria Theatre in San Francisco, and our grant writer, he was one of the most, Jeff Jones, he had attended that, and so he got into the phone with me once, and he said, "Can I come visit you?" I said, "Sure." And so he came all the way to Cupertino to my house, and he said, "What are you doing? Just, you want to aspire to the next level. You must become a non-profit organization. You must start to get bigger grants for, you have so many students now. You can get students, and you can yourself dance with like musicians. So you're a troupe. You're not a solo performer." And I was looking at myself as just a solo. But he said, the moment you get musicians on the stage, you're a group. You're not a solo anymore. So he, persuaded me to become a non-profit organization, and we were incorporated in 1990 as the Avinaya Dance Company of San Jose. And that put us on another track. We got the Rockefeller grant to do our first collaboration with Chitresh Das Dance Company. We did that called The Guru. And Chitresh Das, unfortunately, he passed away, 10 years ago, I think it's been now. And so he actually wouldn't even, he had just learned driving. He was so, all the way from Berkeley. The first time he would come all the way, and we practiced, and I had musicians from India, and we did 3 shows at the Cowell Theatre in Berkeley and San Jose Center for Performing Arts. So, that was our first big production in 1991, very successful. And it just kept going. I think once you do that, once you're on the grant track, is the next grant you write it, and you get, maybe you don't get 1 or 2 grants along the way, but the grants that kept coming with the California Arts Council and the local Arts Council and the City of San Jose. The City of San Jose brought us into their arts incubation project in 1992, I think. And, they incubated us. I don't know if the Stipenders was part of that, but there were a lot of local organizations who were part of that. We were in not far from here, we were in a Park Avenue building, which they had leased, and we all had offices there. And, we kind of introduced us to box office management, there's so many aspects of theatrical production that essentially incubated us to learn. So since then, we've been with all these grants, progressing all the way and producing all the time.
I'd love to learn a little bit about the, I'm in the process of retrieving these legacy artists. Many of them were the first, or maybe one of the first cultural artists to introduce specific cultural art forms to this country, or like maybe Americans already knew this art form, but they really amplified it to a larger audience. Love to learn a little bit, like if around the 1970s and early 80s, you mentioned that you founded Abhinaya or starting doing your work. cultural preservation was very important to you, opportunity to perform very important to you. Tell me a little bit about the cultural landscape around that time in the beginning, late 1970s, early 1980s. Did people, how were you, when you were performing, did people already know about your art form, or you were, oftentimes the first person to introduce that to them? Just tell me a little bit about the cultural landscape of the job.
Okay, well, in 1980 when I came, there were a couple of dance schools like me. I don't know, I'm sure you heard of Catherine Kuriram, she was there before me. And there was another school locally as well, and she was also teaching. But the people that the community that I was performing to was primarily the Indian American community. But the Indian American community were all people who just graduated from college, mostly, and emigrated to the States, right? And most of them growing up didn't know anything about the culture. They only got up, went to school, went to their tech school or whatever, and got a job and came here. And it was a revelation even for them when I got up on stage and say, I'm doing Bharatanatyam. Oh, where does that come from? Oh, South India. Okay. Oh, is that, so they knew only about maybe one or two they may have seen in their growing years. They may have seen one or two. Even my husband had not seen a single dance performance before he got married to me. He remembers seeing one actress dancing like about, way in front, like 3,000 strong audience. He was sitting in the last row and he saw her dancing, I think when he was in his teens. That was the only introduction to dance that he had seen, because that's not something that was very common even for them growing up, because it is an elite art, right? I mean, it's like you have to have the money to buy tickets. You have to have they would all learn. The learning process, they would probably see other people that, but actually seeing a performance means it's a much more expensive event. In fact, Bharatanatyam itself, with all the costumes and all that, is a very expensive thing. It's not, something that anybody can get up and dance, because you have to have these silk saris, you have to have all these silver dipped in gold jewelry. So, it's not easy. It wasn't easy at all. So it was essentially educating this community itself was important for me, to educate them as to the quality of the dance, because there were people who were teaching, but nobody has any incentive to maintain any quality. After some time, they just dance. Then the teachers are there, the parents will insist, oh, can I dance? Can they dance here? Can they dance here? And they'll do all these little community shows. And to insist on a quality performance, to insist on standards, is something that the teacher has to, it's a self thing. So, like for instance, Pandit Chandresh Das, for instance, he insisted on maintaining a certain quality, right, when all his performers danced. But there were so many other Kathak teachers in the area who just taught. Just, it was another source of income for them or whatever, but they didn't have that. So the individual teacher has that standard. So you have that standard for your own community first, to make sure that they understand what standards have been maintained. And then when you go out and perform, so you have a different education. You have to book some even more basic. At least your Indian community, those who, if you're working with some mythological figures like Krishna and Rama or whatever, they know who that is. But in the outside community, you have to have even more basic knowledge that you have to impart to that. But so the main thing that I found out was that you have to insist on the technique first, because the technique of dance is universal. The discipline that you need to, and the movements that we make, this abstract dance that we do with hands, and that's not anything related to the Hindu culture, particularly to the Hindu religion or to the Hindu mythology. It's just dance. It's rhythmic dance. It's dance of the feet, your percussion of the feet, coordinated movements of the hands. So we would insist on presenting that first to them, because that is something anybody can enjoy. The rhythms that are in your body, the beautiful abstract movements that you're making. And then introduce them slowly to how we use our stories are Hindu-based stories or Indian-based stories, to use gestural language in order to, portray different stories and portray different ideas and all that. Um, you know, Either we can use traditionally what we have is our lyrics that we have from the past. But we can also take poetry, for instance, English poetry. So in the 80s, I've also experimented with taking some English poetry and doing gestural language to them and presenting the story through that. So when we did demonstrations in schools, for instance, that's what we would do, is to, present them stories where we use our gestures to present stories like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs or something that's familiar to them. So that's how we try to educate the public about our dance. But in general, yes, they would not have any idea of what it is, what Indian classical dance is. And the fact that that we're going to do it barefoot, the fact that we do not want people around us eating and drinking when we're dancing, which is because it is in essentially an art form that you're not, even if you're not presenting lyrics that are describing the divine or describing a Hindu god, it's still, the art itself is a sacred art form that you do not want to desecrate by dancing when people are just sitting and drinking and disrespecting the art in that form. So those kind of things that we had to, educate the community. Our own community also we have to educate, not just there, not outsiders as well. We have to educate our own community that, this art has to be respected that way. And so that's how we started. The landscape was like that. It's like even at the Ethnic Dance Festival, dancing, for a soloist, for instance, they would give you 5 minutes. And so somehow we had to work our technique so that in that 5 minutes, we are able to project our technique, which is not something we normally do in Indian dance. The musician will start the raga, the melody, and then we'll come on stage and we'll start with their eyes, and then we'll start slowly tapping, and then we'll get into it. Whereas here in 5 minutes, you've got to project everything you want to project. So we had to, kind of tailor our dance pieces and all that so that we'd be getting the information out to the public right.
Yeah, sometimes people think that, sharing our culture in a different cultural context, Eastern culture in the Western culture context, is about sort of, finding the next performance opportunity, but it's in a different cultural context. You just stated a very good example. Hopefully, as time has gone on and time keeps going by, we will have more presenters, more diverse. And now we have our, more different kinds of folks working in funders, right? I've been serving on grant panels for about 20 years. Oftentimes in the very beginning, having to sort of explain it, but now I think less and less because there's more and more knowledge and cultural competency. I mean, that the work continues and really started with pioneers such as yourself. So what I'm hearing from you is this, part of the cultural preservation journey and commitment and work is actually explaining the culture to our own cultural communities. And that's not unique to this community, right? I grew up not knowing a lot about my own culture, right? Myself. So, and tell me a little bit about when you first started out. You mentioned, about your goals. You wanted to make sure the culture was preserved, some solo performance opportunities, but eventually, through what you just shared with me, it became a company. Tell me, in your journey of leading Abhinaya, how has your goal for Abhinaya, for yourself as an artistic leader, your goal for shining the light on this culture, how has that evolved through the decades as Abhinaya has grown?
So, as I said, in the 18th, it was mostly students. That time it was my college opportunities. But in the 90s, once I had made the company and once we had done a successful collaboration like with Pandit Chatresh Das, it appeared that in order to reach audiences, we need to reach the same audiences coming to you every year. So how do we keep them, interested in your art? So one of the first things that we did was to evolve different themes. So even though it was traditional, based traditional, every production that we did was always original. We always thought of some other, thematic production where we take something from the past, but created new pieces in order to present it in a different light to the audience, so that the audience who every year after, sometimes twice a year, we do 2 shows in a year. In the 90s, we were one show in spring, one show in the fall, and each one would be an original production, with new music and new everything. So we kept, thinking in that vein of doing new things, new themes, and collaborations. That was another way of getting different audiences involved with us, was to put a stamp in the community, not that it's just our Indian community, but to also educate them about other art forms that were there. And that's how in 1993, I did a collaboration first, actually, with Margaret Benbow Modern Dance Company. We did a small little collaboration with her. And then we went with San Jose Taiko next in 93. And then after that, we had native collaborations. But in between, in that process, I also, in 93, I think thanks to Margaret Benbow, I was introduced to some of the poetry of Chitra Divakarani, who's the, famous author. And she had written some really wonderful poetry about, women's issues and domestic violence and the abuse at home and all that. And her poetry is really beautiful. And English is written in English. So as growing up in New Delhi, I was not a traditionalist in that sense. I was always rebelling with my parents, saying, why the dowry system? Why should women do this? Why should I not wear this? Why should I not go out and do this? I was always a rebel. So, finding that poetry was really, helped me to think about it, about my dance, being a medium to present all the social issues as well. So 93 itself, I think I started with one very nice piece that I still, Rasika also does after me. It's called Traitor Body, a poem by Chitra Divakarani that talked about, I don't know if you've seen The Verdict many years ago, and how that girl commits suicide because she's pregnant, right? I'm sure you would remember that. That happens everywhere. I mean, even to this day, you can see that happen in some traditional communities, right? Getting pregnant before your marriage and all that. And so she had written a poem about a girl in Bengal and how she succumbs and that she finds another neighbor person who's married and they're celebrating her, but she knows she doesn't have any other recourse but giving up her life. So those are all very radical things to present on stage. On stage, you generally present, happy things all the time. You're only dancing happily, or you're dancing, rhythmic happily, or happy stories of Krishna, drama, and things like that. But bringing a kind of a contemporary idea on the stage was something that, I started doing. And so that's what led me, that I started with Chitra's poems. And then it led me to Gandhi as well. One of the board members, the board chair, was very involved with the Gandhi Peace Foundation in India. And he said, why don't you do a show on Gandhi? And I was saying, I'm not going to do a show on Gandhi. But, somebody has to sow this kind of a seed in you, right? And then you think, and then, I just got this big library of books about world leaders on Gandhi and Gandhi's life, and read his autobiography, and then we put together a production on Gandhi, which turned out to be really successful. It turned out with new music with our local musicians. And so that led, during my work with Gandhi, I also wanted to get other world leaders who were influenced by Gandhi, and that's why I did Martin Luther King as well. And Nelson Mandela, that was before he was released. So I did that, and I think in a year later, after I did that show, he was released from prison, and he became the president of South Africa. So I did all that, so that collaborative work with other people, and then thinking of different themes within our, rather than just mythological themes. Both these two things kept evolving, simultaneously. So one, the March program, we do some different theme, and then for the fall program, we do some collaborative theme. So we had kind of two streams going along so that we kind of keep the traditional going in a different way, and then keep the new thing going as well, for getting new audiences and keeping the audiences interested.
Yeah. So for something that's so interesting that you shared with me is actually for a traditional art form, right? Like one of the things that started at the beginning as a preserved tradition. Is if by following your heart, to utilize your artistic voice to highlight these social issues. Actually, it came off a radical departure, right, from that you said it a few minutes ago, like happy dancers, mythology, and so forth. And yet art is one of the most powerful platforms to tell these kinds of stories, and tell these kind of stories that can be universally understood. Like, why not use Bharatanatyam to tell the story of Nelson Mandela? Right? And I'm sure it was transformative for the dancers as well as the audience.
Yeah.
You've spoken a few times about collaborations. I know Abhinaya has done you've done many collaborations over the years. I would love to ask two questions in one. One, hear about your collaboration with San Jose Taiko, that story, and there are any other sort of highlight collaborations that you'd like to share?
So yes, San Jose Taiko, they met them at the Ethnic Dance Festival at the Asian Pacific and Asian Heritage Council's conclusion. So I met Roy and PJ several times, and so we approached them, and so they had this wonderful idea of not just doing just one piece, but an entire show. So we did an entire show. Where we got a person to write a script for us, a script about an immigrant, coming in and trying to match up. So they'd have one person from them coming and one of us, and they'd chat with each other. First they'll fight, essentially they'll stay away from each other, and then slowly the rhythms will be interesting to this person, and the other person will be interested in this person's rhythm, and then they become friends. And then like that, we kind of we wove a story of an immigrant through, and then we came together at the very end in a collaborative piece. So the collaboration process was the first time that I had done with Chitresh Das. It was mostly Indian, right? But there it's very difficult because it's North Indian music and South Indian music. And one thinks, it's all Indian music, but it's not all, because the pitches differ. The rhythm, the tempo differs. The North Indian tempo is and ours is more like this. And it's not even like, so working with that itself was a pretty difficult process. And here finding similarities was really amazing, because we have San Jose Taiko had this don suko don suko don suko don don. They'd be saying those syllables, and we'll say takadimi takajono. So we found out that there were similar syllables, similar syllables, but syllables, rhythmic syllables that we're using to create, patterns. And so that's how we started exchanging those rhythmic syllables first, and then they had all these moments that, for us, dance is very clearly dance. For them, the drumming itself is a dance, actually. So we had to, learn a little bit of their movements just to understand how the movements and their syllables and all make their drumming not just music but incorporates dance as well. So it was a nice learning process for both of us. And then through the script we presented, it was a really great experience. We did that, I think, through their whole spring production. They had a spring production 1993. So we did that. And that was one. And so that kind of kept us going till 97. I met again in the Ethnic Dance Festival that we performed at the backstage. I would meet all these Balinese dancers. And Balinese dancers and Balinese Tamil musicians, they would come and say, oh, we love your dress. And then we'd look at their costume and we'd look at their, the rhythms that they were doing. And we were, started a conversation with them. And that's when we did a collaboration with them. We did an initial just one piece with them in 96. And then we learned that, you start learning things. It's all a process of learning, right? When you're growing up in India, you're not really listening and learning about all the cultures and all their little details. You don't know. You just know, okay, Bali is there. And this is, we're here. Indonesia is there. India is here. You don't really learning of all the little details that they have. So then you learn that Bali was Hindu. They have the same mythological story as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata that is based on our Hindu epics. So we found all those commonalities. And in the Ramayana, which is one of our epics, there is so many variations within India itself, from north to south. You have many variations in the Ramayana. In the same way, you have Asian variations in the Ramayana, which is through Thai variations, Balinese variations, Japanese too. Each country, wherever the Hindu tradition traveled, the Ramayana tradition also traveled, and they had their own names and for the same epic. So we found that commonality, and we decided to make yet a new. Again, our collaboration process was great because we decided to create a new script, which combined theirs and ours, and we created a kind of a combined script for the Ramayana, and that they took on the role of the evil people, and we took on the role of the good people, and we kind of created a narrative like that. And that was a very interesting collaboration as well in 97. The next year, because they used Larry Reed of Shadowlight Theatre, and he was the narrator that he came for that show. He said, why don't we do something together? And so in the next year, we did a show called The Power of Saturn, where he came to the South. We had created his entire screen and did a shadow light on the back, and he did a different story, Power of Saturn. He did all this beautiful, he kind of draws it up himself in plate, and makes it himself with the help of his people from Bali, I think, again. All create those cutouts, and then they put it in front of the land and how to create the shadow. So he did that with us in 1999. We did that. And so, it was interesting because you learn you learn, as I said, about the culture, you learn about a different art form. I mean, we didn't learn enough about shadow light to do it ourselves, but we learned how intricate that art form is, that, we're sharing something, we're sharing your intricacy and we're learning something. And so that is fun.
Yeah, I think we need to have that just to instill string some of the things. Yeah, as far as the shadow lights, the shadow light collaboration and the Abhinaya Senonse Taiko collaboration, and you mentioned, I think you used the word revelation, yes, as your experience in participating at the dance festival, especially the first time. Really, I think that's been such an important part of the mission of our organization over the years in providing visibility platform for different cultures, and on stage and also backstage for the different cultures to different cultural artists to get to know each other. Some of them have got married after meeting backstage. Interesting. Yes. And then we've seen quite a few collaborations that have resulted in just sort of, I see you on stage at the festival, or hey, hanging out backstage together. You know, the similarities and the differences of the beautiful sharing. It's so beautiful to me. It's like the formula for world peace, really.
Exactly. I know my dancers, when they performed there in the festival, they would always, wait for the Sedani, because the Sedani, when they came together, and that there's all these, the drummers and then the dancers of every culture coming together, and then they'd all jam together. I think the younger dancers really look forward to that. As an older dancer, I used to be a little, like, be a little kind of stand aside. I wasn't one of those who joined and, jumping around with them. But I think the younger generation really got into it, and they really enjoyed every aspect of that, of mingling, of knowing and meeting different people. And, you don't really do that. I mean, you're going to school, you go to school and you come back and you meet, maybe you have, a couple of friends of Asian or other whoever you meet in school, but you really don't know enough of anybody, right? But in the Ethnic Dance Festival, the meeting them, knowing their music, knowing their culture, knowing their food, everything was kind of open to a revelation. Everything was a revelation. It's for every participant who was there. It was really a great place for us to enroll, enjoy.
Well, speaking of younger dancers, over the years I've seen so many younger dancers call you auntie. If you reflect on your legacy of your impact over these past 40 plus years now, what do you think your impact has been and is for the younger generation of artists, of community?
So for the younger generation, I have to first say that they have to respect the tradition. They have to make sure that they have a good foundation in it. There's nothing that comes easy. You cannot say, I'm going to come learn it for 3 months or 1 year and I'm going to be proficient in it. That's not the kind of, any art form. You need to delve into it. So you have to respect the tradition and give it the amount of time that it needs for you to understand, and you have a basic good foundation in that, in the technique and in the, in the literature, in the technique that goes behind it. The theory, especially in Indian dance, there's so much theoretical thing that goes into it, the gestures, the meanings and all that. So they have to have a solid understanding of the need, that they have to have a need for putting aside that time, that discipline, that dedication to get a basic foundation is very, very important. I think that there's no easy, double jumping across and getting to the next level. You have to have that basic foundation, the basic number of years of grounding in the art. And then they should be curious. They should be ready to, move to the next level of sharing it, of learning from others, of learning to use the basic knowledge that they received to get other ideas across social, because we have done social justice and other themes, use that basic, but understand that you have to respect the tradition first and then only move on to the next level, and not just jump straight on to what I would call fusion or anything else, unless you've given yourself that time to understand the basic first. And then, of course, yes, you have to be curious, you have to be open to ideas, you have to be open to all cultures, because there's so much to learn from everybody. Imagine African drumming. I don't know anything about it at all. I know that if I took some lessons, I would have to, delve in it for at least a year or so before I understand anything about it. It's like that, if you have to spend the time to learn anything else as well.
As you look at the next generation of culture leaders, and you're looking at the next 30, 50 years, what do you hope that next generation of culture leaders will carry forward? What is your aspiration for you?
My like I again I'm saying the same thing, that they have to have a good solid knowledge of music and dance, both the Indian music and Indian dance. You cannot just jump to any level unless you get that grounding, and that's important. And then um, I don't want them to dilute the art form. The art form should not be diluted. Whatever they do, the basic technique that they have learned should be maintained wherever they have, whatever they do. That is, Bharatanatyam has a certain form to it. You're sitting and, you're stretching, you're sitting in a certain posture. All that cannot be diluted. In the name of doing new things, they cannot dilute the art form. The art form and its technique should be maintained in its, the strength of that art form should not be diluted. It should be maintained. And then, of course, ideas and themes and all that development, I want them to do it because they are, after all, living in a world where they're intermingling with so many cultures. They have to move on, but they should make sure that the basic technique, the basic foundation is not diluted as they, because if you start diluting it, then the next generation to that will dilute it even more. And before long, you will, you won't even know what is it. You won't even know where it came from. Or just, the art form will be completely, kind of lost. So that they have to be really careful about that.
Thank you. And in the spirit of reflection, if you think back again to 1988 now, I know you've spoken about so much of the work in the beginning, especially, was about educating both your own community and community at large, right? About what is the cultural tradition, what is Bharatanatyam, and how to respect performers when they're facing a stage, right? Now in 2026, how do you think that perception has evolved as you've been so many years of trying to do that work in educating people about the culture, about the dance form?
It's a tough question because the community that we started out with was very small. It was, for instance, it was all India based, in the sense we had representations from every part of India, and all of us each come together as one, literally. I would say it was a melting pot of India, in this area at the time in 1980s. But now it's like almost every Indian community is separately being represented by 2,000 strong people. Each community, that is each state in India, and we have about 16 languages represented in more than several states in India. Each state is having its own community, and it's become pretty large. So, how do we maintain keep that unity? I think that I feel is being lost in this, there's more segregation, I feel now, of different communities rather than when it was in the 1980s. I would have people from all over India as my students, and now I find that, that there is a little more segregation that I'm not very happy with. But so we want to make sure that the next generation goes beyond that. They should go beyond, where are you coming from? Which part of India are you coming from? You're coming from India means you have to kind of think of a unified identity. And then if you're unified, then you're unified in your relationship with the new community that you're here along with here as well. Instead of, because the community is so large now that it's really hard to not keep them segregated. They have to kind of make an effort to become one.
Yeah.
It's very strange. You may not be aware of it at all because you see, a lot of people see us as Indian, right? But, we're Indian from South India, we're Indian from Tamil Nadu, we're Indian from Kerala, we're in South Indian from Andhra Pradesh. And we have so many different dance styles going on. There were some dance styles from Punjab, dance styles from the north, Kathak is from the north. So, how do we make sure that, we present a unified stance towards the group that we are staying in, has lived, and to the community? We owe that to the community to be unified ourselves, then present that unified stance to that we mingle with others, keep that in mind rather than. It's hard for us to even get together within our own groups, if you don't make an effort.
It's good to grow, but then part of the growth is what you just stated, So hopefully we can aspire, in the future. That would be one of the aspirations and hopes, that to still, as the numbers grow, right, there's a set, sort of natural, organic sort of separation, but how can we still be together even though the numbers grow? As we begin to wrap up, rightly, I want to make sure we cover, the different things you wanted to share with me. Were there questions I did not ask you? Were there things you specifically wanted to share with me that we did not cover?
So did I say? Yeah, what I would like to say is that being an artist is not easy. I'm training so many dancers, but not everybody takes it as a living, right? And not everybody takes it as the only profession that they can follow. So it's if you want to make a living as an artist, you have to make a lot of sacrifices. So that's something that people do not understand. When you're growing up and my friends, for instance, will say, "Why don't you come join us?" I'll say, "No, I have a class. I have a performance to attend, or I have some students who are coming today. I cannot come." So most of being an artist means you put aside your family, you put aside so many other things. You make a lot of sacrifices. So I think that's one thing that as the next generation, if they want to take it as a profession, they have to realize it's not a difficult. It's a very difficult choice. They have to make difficult choices in life. It's not just as easy as saying I can take a 9-to-5 job, because an artist profession is not a 9-to-5 job. It's all through the day. It's like more than 60 hours in a week for sure. You're constantly thinking about the art. Your family and your children and everybody becomes secondary. So. Being an artist is not an easy undertaking. So you need to understand that. That's one of the things I would like to mention. That you haven't, you didn't ask me about an artist. What an artist means, like I would have to get up at 5:30 in the morning and have my classes in the morning, so that I would at 7 o'clock be able to still give my girls a breakfast and take them to school or whatever. My husband was a great supporter, wonderful supporter. But even so, you have so many during the year. If he wants to go on vacation, I'll say, "I'm so sorry, I have a performance. I have 3 performances lined up. I cannot go on a vacation." So even now we have that problem coming up. As an artist, you have to live with that.
Well, we appreciate your sacrifice and dedication, perseverance over a decade, and for Arts West, you were definitely part of the first generation of the visionary and revolutionary first generation artists in our community, whose strong shoulders we stand on and continue to stand on. We appreciate you paving the path for so many of us.
Thank you.
In your own cultural community and outside communities. you look for you for inspiration and aspiration. And we look for you for continuing strength as we carry on this life of perseverance that's very difficult at times. Sometimes it's the daily getting up 5 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes it is proving that our culture is worthy to be on Carnegie Hall or whatnot. And or is it proving that, our organization, our culture is worthy of getting that NEA grant, right? So, just on behalf of the community, really want to express that to you before we get to the last question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Optional closing question.
Again,
If you had to describe your journey in one word, what would that be?
it's an elusive search for perfection. I don't know whether it's not one word. I would say, yeah, I guess if you want to break it down into one word, it would be, I would say, journey. It's a continuous journey. It's a journey that never ends because every art, whatever you've taken, whatever you've learned, is just a drop in the ocean that any art form is made of. And so it's a continuous journey.
Everlasting journey, everlasting to. I think that's a great place to end our conversation. It was coming to the end of an hour. Thank you so much, Ms. Maithili. This is one of the many conversations to come, and look forward to continuing that dialogue with other legacy artists on August 22nd.
Yeah, great. Wonderful. Look forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely.